The folder arrived unmarked, threadbare, smelling of damp wood and solvent. On top lay a carbon copy stamped in violet, First Directorate, RSFSR, 1959. The memo spoke in the clean, glassy language of necessity. A forest reserve near a closed city, kilometers of feeder lines, a low-frequency array for ionospheric probing, and a request for additional guards. Locals called the place the Red Forest, long before the word became a brand for catastrophe. In thaw years, the needles browned early, foxes turned up with bald patches along their flanks, and on certain afternoons, a metallic taste settled on the tongue like pocket change. The city had no name on maps. Mail came addressed to a post office box in Sverdlovsk Oblast, and its people learned to introduce themselves with patronymics and shift schedules, never streets. Between the birches and pylons, a cable trench ran arrow straight to a fenced compound with a corrugated roof and a wooden guardroom that smelled of wet felt boots. A sign said, Forestry Experiment Station. Number 3, but everyone called it the antenna field. Workers joked about lightning you could switch on and off, about the way your comb crackled without touching hair, about the dog that howled at silent noon. No one joked about the broadcast. At night, old radiograms in kitchen drawers clicked on by themselves. A carrier tone like a held breath, 3 knocks, pause, 3 knocks, then a woman's voice as if read from a ledger. 4 digits, a surname, a date not yet filmed in the calendar. People said it started with someone's cousin in the telephone exchange in 1957, during the monsoon of rumors that followed the accident near Chelyabinsk. They said the first list named miners from a shaft outside Nizhny Tagil. They said the shaft's entrance collapsed 5 days later. They said a van from the city took the radios and left receipts with signatures that wavered in the thin ink like reeds. A man from the radio club at the Palace of Culture kept a notebook. He wrote down frequencies, 4625, 4627, 4630 kHz, too close to be an accident, too deliberate to be a prank. He wrote down names he did not know, colloquial spellings, the way a woman from the steppe would pronounce a consonant softened by T. He wrote down the times the voice came, dusk or after the whistle of the last shift. Over 4 nights he circled the same neighborhood on the map with a pencil stub, as if the voice were a lamp behind a curtain. When he went to the militia to ask whether it was legal to log official transmissions, the desk sergeant said, without looking up, "You're logging weather." A week later, the clubroom shelves were rearranged, licenses inspected, the notebook gone. The man's friends remember him weeks after that, sitting backwards on a chair, scratching a burn on his wrist he said was a soldering accident. In his pocket lay a fortnight-old slip from the morgue showing a row of tags with numbers that matched the week's 4-digit blocks. "Coincidence," said the club director. 0157 is someone's order number for plywood. It could be a trolley's mark, a meter box. But the director stopped locking the club after dusk. But the man's wrist healed into a pale crescent, the color of dry paper. But at night, in the houses along the feeder road, people started unplugging their sets and sleeping with pillows against the kitchen doors to muffle anything that tried to speak out of wire. A paper from 1962, stamped in a cavalry blue ink, summarized an inspection of LES-3 expedition assets and recommended stronger discipline. It mentioned an auxiliary sounder and prophylactic radiation work, terms that seemed to belong to dentists and radio astronomers, but the signatories wore the milky initials of another trade, Second Main Directorate, State Security. There was a photo of men in quilted jackets standing under a trellis of wire strung across white sky, and another of a ledger page with columns labeled Surname, Service Number, Next of Kin. 2 columns redacted with a black rectangle drawn not by brush or block, but carefully by hand. The report complained of excessive local talk, of guards telling a legend in the nearby settlement that the forest would answer your question if you held a metal spoon in your teeth on a windy day. It listed 4 deaths that spring, 3 due to accident, logging, vehicle, chain failure, and one undetermined after exposure. In the margin, someone had written, also, voice online, record if repeats. The addendum ordered handsets to be checked with shielding fabric issued for pregnant radiographers at the clinic. The inventory showed fewer meters than men. The note closed with names of birds found dead under the wires, waxwing, hawfinch, thrush, and an instruction to collect only in paper, not polythene. A nurse from the closed city's hospital told her daughter years later that she had seen a stack in the basement, toe tags in a saucer, each with the same neat square digits she had sometimes heard recited at night when the neighbor's radio came alive on its own. She remembered a smell like damp rye and copper, the clatter of enamel bowls, a clock that ran slow in the room where they kept old electrotherapy machines and heart stimulators that were never used because the chief refused to trust spare parts that came without a stamp. "We don't have ghosts," the chief told his staff. "We have paperwork." But when a bad month ran long, the nurse said, the power would dip once a day the moment the trolley passed a particular pole. She said a man in a brown uniform with no insignia asked for her handwriting specimens and then wrote down the names of those she'd undressed for washing in a manner more careful than would be needed merely to count. She said the stacked toe tags had the same color as bread ration cards in winter, and that when you held one to the light, the paper glittered with metal dust. She told her daughter to find a good job elsewhere, where hills looked like hills and not like piled slag. The daughter left for Novosibirsk, and the nurse spoke less often again, as if she had returned to a script no one asked her to read. By 1968, the dossiers speak in a different voice. Mathematics, matrices, predictive optimization under constrained broadcast conditions. The antenna field received a second trench and a row of boxy housings like garages. The phrase used is vectorization of harm, an administrative way to say that if a name were written on Thursday, the district would not hang a funeral banner until Sunday. A litany of failed experiments litters the pages. Geomagnetic coupling tested with a portable coil on a barge, bad data, a low cloud seeded with silver iodide from a propeller aircraft, inconclusive, a wire wrapped around the trunk of a dying pine, its cambium red-brown under the knife, no response. The forest, someone wrote in pencil between lines, did not love instruments, but loved voice. That winter, a flight from Omsk clipped a ridge near Kurgan, and the file makes a point of insisting the pilot was not on any list. "We are not witches," the director writes, though no one had accused him of such a thing. "We are statisticians." It is the only joke in the folder. In 1976, a new sound arrived, a woodpecker's hammer from the east that chewed the band clean. People in Kiev cursed it. Swedes swore. In kitchens from Vorkuta to Vladivostok, men knocked the radio casing and asked who had left the metronome on. The memos call it duga, a lattice of iron in a field lined precisely north-south. Some letters argue our forest and their arc would cooperate. Some say they will tangle. In a stapled note, an engineer requests a meeting with a colonel to present mortality series synchronization and is made to wait 5 hours under a portrait of a man in a marshal's cap with eyes like rubbed coal. The engineer later writes privately that his work is about the future tense of names, not about radar. The colonel writes back that radar pays the bills and names pay no one, least of all the dead. By 1982, the tone of the papers is brittle. They request calm and non-interference from factory committees, apologize for fellings in Compartment 17 that crossed into a picker's path, and enclose an invoice for waxed paper and cotton-wrapped wire. There is a clipping about a fox litter born without tails and a margin mark next to a line. It chased its own absence until it fell. There is a diagram of ground with the word Pripyat penciled in and an arrow pointing to a swathe labeled Red Forest. But the folder insists the name existed before the blast, and perhaps it did. 3 days before April 26, 1986, a ham in Belarus with a reel-to-reel recorder caught the ledger voice reading a full minute of digits and surnames. On the afternoon of the 28th, two men with suitcases collected his tape, and both asked for tea, and one gave the host a licorice candy unchanged since his own school days. The ham kept a copy hidden under the tub, but by the time anyone wanted to hear it, the glue had bled and the oxide turned to rust. The printed denied slips for requests to retrieve audio assets have a pattern like fish scales when stacked together, as if someone had stamped them while thinking of water. After the blast, the forest went the color of a roof tile, and people learned to say exclusion zone, as if it were a road you could take with the right pass. The broadcast did not stop. It simply moved. In a summer camp for young pioneers, men strung wire along the rafters of a dining hall still decorated with painted hands and slogans about wheat. A woman read from a list in a voice like someone practicing a new alphabet. The memo insists she was rehearsing for a civil defense drill. A child found a coil labeled with a number and brought it to his grandfather, a retired linesman, who put it against his wrist and said he felt the same cold spread as when he tested a live wire in winter with a glove thin as paper. The camp closed again, the doors nailed with a carpenter's care. Visitors later found the numbers repainted on the wood, as if someone had hung a new calendar with only 2 weeks in it, forever starting, never ending. Their photographs show a table set with plates that collected the dust of years in neat crescents. In the spring of 1991, the files thin and buckle. Someone notes that the operating budget will be moving to another account, that supply chains must adapt to vouchers, that the Guard will accept cash in lieu of rations if paid in the first week. A journalist from a provincial station makes a pitch about the antenna forest and arrives with a camera that uses cassettes too good for the station to replace. He interviews a man who says he once changed fuses in the Red Forest and shows a burn scar you could cover with a matchbox. The cameraman writes on a white card, "Sound of woodpecker, add here." The journalist leaves with boxes of paper wrapped in butcher's twine and dies 6 months later in a road accident outside Perm. The boxes never make it to the station. In a list of recovered objects from the wreck are notations: 3 binders, 4 unstapled, 1 tape, unlabeled, 1 child's drawing of a tree with red crown and black roots. The files record the journalist's blood alcohol as 0. They record his mother's request for the return of the drawing. They record nothing about the tape. In the late 1990s, men with flashlights and bolt cutters visited the antenna field at night and came away with copper they sold in small cities where the old smelter gates still welcomed scrap with a squeal that sounded like an oath. The pylons, sawed near the ground, leaned and fell into the trees. Hikers who came for abandoned places found no dish to photograph, no radar to climb, only trenches furred with grass, and a hiss in their earbuds when they scanned the band along 4.6 Menarehers. A guide said the hiss was static, and that if you listened to enough static, you'd hear what you wanted. The guide said he once met a man who said the last time he wore his old factory badge, his radio spoke his name the day before his breath smoked white in a hospital corridor in March. The guide said that man learned to go without radios, clocks, and doors that shut tight. But when the guide returned to that settlement 2 years later, the street was a funnel of weeds, and a shop's handwritten sign read, "Closed for inventory," since a date that kept falling farther into the past. A last document lies at the bottom, a scan of a map overwritten with grease pencil and coffee rings. Someone has traced a line from a Ural postbox to a field west of Kiev, to a hospital in Tomsk, to a radio tower near Khabarovsk. The line stops in a circle laced with triangles and arrows titled Probable Reception Nodes. The note beneath says, "We hear what we train ourselves to hear. We calculate what we refuse to call fate. The rest is weather." Another note in a different hand adds, "The rest is policy." Somewhere on a band you do not listen to, a carrier holds. Somewhere in a kitchen radio plugged into a cracked 2-pin socket, a relay clicks like a tongue on a dry pallet. The names come slowly now, or maybe they have been spoken all along and the habit of listening died when the habit of denial did. The last page of the last file is blank but smells faintly of ozone. If you ask officials, they will tell you the Red Forest was a timber plot, that the broadcast was a navigation aid, that coincidences are inevitable in a country of so many names and so much weather. If you ask local people, they will show you a deer antler turned the color of clay and swear a hunter found it hanging from a wire like a tuning fork. If you ask the old radio man who keeps a jar of corroded batteries on his sill, he'll say he cannot sleep on a Thursday when the air goes thin, and he'll ask whether you have ever felt a word pass through you before it was spoken. And if you ask the folder, it will return you to the beginning, a reserve, a trench, a woman reading a list that looks like a clean receipt for losses not yet booked. Did the Union erase a city to cover a mistake? Or was the city the story, and the mistake the only thing left standing beneath a forest that reddens on cue, beneath a transmission that knows you before the registry does? Tune the dial in a dark room and tell me whether the voice chooses you or whether you choose the voice. They called the settlement Lesogorsk until the maps forgot it. In the first file with a legible date, 1947, the signature block reads, Special Construction Directorate No. 9, Ministry of Internal Affairs. The letter orders 22 railcars of creosoted poles and a mobile substation to a siding with no station name, only a kilometer post, and a handwritten note, Bring bread and canvas, the wind strips skin. The work brigade roster draws on everywhere people don't ask questions, parolees from a metallurgy plant fire, special settlers from the steppe, 4 men from a convoy rerouted in Omsk when a guard broke his ankle on ice. The NKVD foreman's daily sheets sketch the first trench as if laying a scar across a living thing. Straight runs, anchor pits, splices soldered under canvas when the snow came back in April. Above these practical lines there is a sentence no one required him to write. Trees whisper metal. The resin sparks. He underlined it. He never underlined anything else. A school opens in a barrack with a stove made of welded pipe. The teacher notes in the margins of her lesson plan the way the chalk snaps after the bell when the transformer breathes. She teaches arithmetic, then, in the same neat hand, records a superstition she heard at the breadline. If a dog sleeps with its nose to the wire fence, someone in that row of houses will wear a black ribbon within the week. The superstition spreads like a spill. Miners spit over their left shoulder when passing a junction box. The barber taps his razor on the tap twice before shaving anyone with a wedding ring. Children spin their radio's tuning wheels the wrong way before turning them off. When a boiler in a timber shed explodes under a crescent moon and throws roofing 2 streets away, the bulletin says negligence. The teacher's private note says the Tuesday Voice had read 6 digits ending in the fireman's patronymic. Someone crosses out that line with a ruler, once, clean. The first engineer to write about voice does it obliquely. He files a requisition for a Faraday cage to exclude the effect of environmental narrativity on equipment, a phrase that earns him a visit. Men whose belts are hidden beneath long coats ask him why he uses language that belongs to priests. He takes them to the feeder road and stands them under a span of wet wire and asks them to taste the air. He is transferred to a hydroelectric station in Tuvan country 6 weeks later. In his drawer, the next engineer finds a wrapper from a chocolate brought back from Czechoslovakia by someone who knew how to take train seats that weren't on the manifest. On the inside of the wrapper, 4 digits are scribbled in violet copying pencil. A year passes before anyone realizes they match the morgue book from a bus rollover outside Karpinsk. The city in those years runs on anonymity. The party secretary says this with pride. Factory chimneys burn low to keep attention away. Visitors from Sverdlovsk are told they are in a logging town with an experimental nursery. The nursery sells seedlings in April. They die in May if planted within sight of the pylons. The clinic's midwife keeps a list of infants with a subtle tremor in their eyelids when the transformers step up. She is told to file her note under late-season flu complications. In the radio club, the director burns a pork chop on a hot soldering iron to demonstrate harmless heat to mothers who have come to complain. No one believes him. They keep the complaint book open on the desk, like a ledger of confessions. Names fill it, then are torn out once a month and tucked into a brown envelope stamped with a number no one repeats. A forester named Krylov writes a seasonal report in 1954 that starts as forestry and ends as augury. Compartment 12, abnormal bark flaking. Needles redden before frost. Jays avoid span rows after rain. Found a deer in the ravine with antlers lacquered by sap dust. Surface conductive? He pages himself with the urgency of someone sending a message to a future that will misplace him. On the back, he copies, in block letters, a voice he heard riding home on the timber tram. 0432, Miranova, Yelena, Saturday. He does not know any Miranova. Saturday comes, the timber tram does not run. On Sunday, the bulletin board carries a notice. Comrade Miranova, switchboard, accident while disembarking, funeral by work committee. Krylov folds his report in thirds and adds a leaf from the red spruce that stains his fingers. When the file copies it, the leaf is gone, but a lozenge of resin remains on the page that smells like burnt sugar when the room is warm. Official denials acquire craft. The regional newspaper prints a piece headlined, "Voice of Progress, Our Forest, a Laboratory for Tomorrow," next to a photograph of a smiling girl with a radio, staged in the Palace of Culture. The same week, the militia posts a notice finding amateur hoaxers who invent dangerous rumors about illegal broadcasts. In the factory canteen, a man reads the notice aloud in a voice that mimics the ledger woman's cadence. His friends laugh and nudge him. 3 days later, he falls from the gantry while unloading timber. The crane operator swears he saw the cable slacken as if the hook decided to remember gravity. The inspector writes, "Operator error." The canteen replaces its notice board with a clean one. The old board leans behind the kitchen, letters indenting the varnish like dental impressions. If you touch the grooves on a rainy day, your fingertips tingle as if you licked a 9-volt. From the KGB come forms that pretend to be ordinary. Form 11 for recording incidents of social panic, Form 27 for inventory of confiscated apparatus, an addendum ordering the cessation of non-sanctioned gatherings at dusk in the clearing near the third span. The clearing is where schoolchildren had dared each other to stand in a circle facing outward, while someone whispered the alphabet. If the whisperer reached a name that belonged to a family in the circle, a pine cone fell without wind. The operative who filed the stop order includes a human sentence. Children refuse to run afterward. They walk in line to the canteen. For this, he receives an underline in red pencil on his performance review. Excess detail. Folklore grows in the seams of bureaucratic language. Old women pin needles of wire to their windowsill geraniums to teach them to ignore the air. A man who once worked in a gulag sawmill in the north swears that on fog days, the fence buzz sounds like the hymn. The prisoners whistled when the guard tower turned its back. A teenage girl writes a poem in which a radio falls in love with a name and cannot stop repeating it. Her teacher confiscates it and reads it that night to his wife, who says it is not a poem, it is a confession, and if he doesn't burn it, she will. He burns it on the stove, and the flame makes a blue ring like a gas leak. In a yearbook from Class 10A, 6 faces have been pasted twice. The second set fades faster, as if printed on paper that has expectations. Then there is the linesman, a careful man who liked things coiled correctly. In 1959, he logged a morning spent with a supervisor from higher authority, testing impedance along the trench after a thunderstorm. The log, recovered later from his widow's attic, records no numbers, only places where the pencil pressed harder, as if the wire under the ground had risen to meet the graphite. At the final entry, he drew 3 small squares. Under them he wrote, 3 knocks. He pressed so hard the paper dented the page below. The supervisor shook his hand and said he'd done well. The next evening, the linesman heard a woman's voice through the wall of his kitchen, as if it had found a path from socket to skull. It read a number he knew, his daughter's exam passport. The date it gave was 2 days away. He sent his daughter to her aunt's in Serov that night. On the day in question, the school bus braked for a cow and slid into a ditch. No one died. This is the only story in the folder with a happy ending, and even it does not hold. 2 winters later, the daughter married a machinist, and their son was born with a birthmark in the shape of a circle with 3 dots. People disappear in ways that look like transfers until you line the cards up. The radio club man, the teacher who underlined her own chalk notes, the forester, Krylov, after a letter requesting a move for health reasons, a nurse who refused to give a handwriting sample. The file marks them as relocated or resigned. A marginal hand adds dates that do not match paybook closures. It is easy to say they went willingly, many did, but their names keep showing in the strangest place. A list in a sealed envelope in a desk in a city with no name on maps, read aloud by a voice that never stumbles, never coughs, never asks for water. When the voice falls silent, for years sometimes, the settlement breathes easier. Births look more like births than negotiations, and the canteen's notice board holds recipes instead of obituaries. Then some Thursday the air goes thin, and the spoons in the drawer tremble, and someone's old radiogram hums without permission. The official answer says, solar storm. The folk answer says, accounting. Between them lies a trench that never quite closes, no matter how many springs fill it with melt. They called the experiment a meteorology study until it needed a code name. Then it became Glass 9, and later, when the letters grew tired, simply The Station. The files from 1960, 1963 smell of acetone and damp cardboard, and share a habit of writing around the truth. A requisition for spare capacitors and 5 lids for the burial vaults sits beside a blueprint of a building whose rooms have no doors on the plane, only arrows. A margin note says, access via cable haul. The best description we have comes from a technician's safety lecture, recovered as an onion skin carbon sheet. Do not handle the E-field probes without grounding strap. Do not hang tools on conductor ladders. If you hear the list operator, place the handset on the table. Do not speak into it. No one signed the lecture. The station installed a cross of guide masts in a clearing and pinned the soil with copper stars, then fed the lattice with a hum so low sleepers beside the fence dreamed they were inside a refrigerator. The radiogram readings went from occasional to calendared. The voice now favored Thursdays and the dusk before payday, as if including its own footnote on human attention. The list operator appears first in a blue folder with a missing clasp. Unidentified female voice, neutral accent, monotone delivery, reads 4-digit blocks followed by surnames and patronymics. Intermission signals, 3 knocks, or brief continuous carrier. A second sheet adds non-interrogative, no acknowledged receipt, no repeats for recognition. Engineers learned to treat it as weather, quantify, plot, average, never ask why. Militiamen, less patient, listened for friends and pretended they didn't. A baker confessed to a priest who had not heard a confession in years. The priest wrote a letter to an old classmate in Tomsk about a broadcast that believes in itself more than we believe in radio, and the classmate mailed him a roll of lead foil used for X-ray films with instructions on how to line a kitchen cabinet. The priest died of a stroke in his sleep weeks later. His name had never been read, according to the notes in his nephew's hand. Or perhaps it had, and the nephew, who worked as a driver for the forestry office, stopped writing the column of surnames at the wrong place every time the voice said, Father. A KGB major arrived with 2 suitcases and a habit of writing the time in full minutes and seconds. His reports are precise and obtuse, the way a man speaks when he is being overheard by history. Correlation attempts between RO, reading order, and incident registry I-23A suggest no causality, only framing. Then, in the same paragraph, nevertheless, prophylaxis indicated, recommend targeted postponements. He instituted distractions, staggered shift rotations, extra pay on Mondays, civic songs played from factory tannoys at dusk. For a month, the mortality registry slowed, not because death paused, but because the paperwork stalled in queues for stamps. People took it as reprieve. The voice resumed with a new trick, first names only, as if leaning over a fence to speak to you privately. 2 entries later, it began pronouncing years backwards. 1963, 62, 61. The major ordered the tapes boxed and sent to Sverdlovsk for analysis. The box arrived sealed and empty. The courier denied tampering. On the lid, a thumbnail had gouged the cardboard in 3 neat marks. The station's science hardened into ritual. Twice a month, operators swept the band with a loop antenna on a handcart and recorded the way tree canopies rang when a cloud bank passed. They learned which pines sang true like a bell made of tin, which drowned the signal like a drum packed with wet moss. A memo from the director to the district committee lists bioeffects: headaches, metallic taste, sleep without dreams, a rash that mapped itself onto the pattern of the wire fence. People in the settlement adapted their own countermeasures. Housewives lined cupboards with the priest's X-ray foil. Miners wore their helmets indoors. Grandmothers put a sewing needle in a glass of water beside the bed to see if it quivered at the hour when the voice often came. Children learned a counting-out rhyme that always ended with 3 taps on the tabletop. Someone scratched a warning onto the tram shelter: "Do not listen with both ears." Official denials came with more grammar. A Sverdlovsk newspaper sent a man to write about pioneering ionospheric sounding. He returned with a story about migratory geese that circled the pylons as if they had lost the north. His editor replaced the geese with tractors and the circling with productive rotation. When the journalist insisted, the paper printed a correction that was not a correction. No unauthorized transmissions were detected. Any resemblance to operational signals is coincidental. The station's guards cut down the tram shelter and burned it. The ash smelled like hot coins. A photograph survives of that day. 4 men in padded jackets, a bent sign. Behind them a horizon of scrub pine the color of an old wound. There is a streak across the frame, bright, as if the film itself had tried to erase something in motion. By 1965, the station kept a ledger of right name, wrong body incidents, cases where the voice read a surname attached to a man who survived while another with the same name died. The ledger is written in a meticulous female hand on graph paper. Margin notes offer hypotheses their authors did not want to own. Homonyms function as false doors. Intention trumps identity. The forest knows only the surname. In entry 37, a laborer named Sokolov hears his own name and goes to his brother's house to sleep there for 3 nights. A log truck overturns at his own gate the night he would have been home. Entry 51, Amironov drinks himself unconscious after hearing the voice. His wife, who shares the name, goes to work early and collapses on the factory stairs. The ledger ends mid-line. The next page is blank and flecked with resin, as if someone laid a twig there and forgot it. A stamp on the cover says, "Archive for disposition." Below it, a pencil adds, "Keep." Rumors crawled along the girders of the city's memory. Men from the Ural electrochemical plant, passing through, said their spectrometers flashed white squares when the station ran nights. A woman from Kishtim visiting her sister whispered that the Red Forest name was stolen from farther west, and that thieves always keep the manner of the theft. A former guard remembered a night exercise when silence fell like a lid 5 minutes before the voice. Frogs stopped, the transformer hum narrowed to a wire, and the dog's bark died in its throat. He said he never heard the last of the 3 knocks. His hearing vanished between the 2nd and 3rd. It returned with the morning. When accidents came, the station filed letters that mixed empathy with accounting. To the widow of Comrade B, our deepest condolences on the tragic loss resulting from unsafe timber stacking. The committee will honor Comrade B with a banner during the October holiday. Then a paragraph about safety goggles and approved ladder heights. Then a line that does not fit. Please return the Bakelite receiver you listed on your property declaration, as it belongs to a collective asset. Widows gave back radios like returning a borrowed book that had read them instead. In the canteen, a cook posted a notice: Thursdays buckwheat, Fridays fish, Saturdays do not ask for names. The engineers tried to be engineers. They tested Q feeds, rotated phases, tuned and detuned, proved that the voice did not originate in their yard by triangulating with 2 telegraph offices who owed them favors. The triangle pointed into forest deeper than any road went without Army permission. For a week, they set a recorder to run with no input. The tape came back with a ghost of the voice, weaker, older, as if recorded in a room with curtains. One man called it print-through, another called it memory. The oldest man in the room, who had built radios in a prison camp from breadboards carved out of breadboards, said very quietly that every machine eventually remembers what it meant to be a tree. By the end of the decade, the station installed a room everyone called the aquarium: glass walls, mesh ceiling, a desk with a microphone no one touched. Once a quarter, according to a schedule stamped confidential, a woman would sit in the aquarium and read from a list of names assembled from factory rosters and school rolls. She did not know the people. She read like a clerk. The tape of her voice would then be sent to Sverdlovsk with 2 seals, a ragged wax, and a clean plastic. The aquarium had a drain in the floor. The minute book says it was for condensation. The janitor who mopped it said the mop head smelled like mint and lightning. He did not ask questions. He was, in those years, a graduate of not asking. When his daughter came down with a fever that did not turn to sweat, he hand-carried a note asking for a postponement of Thursday. The note is still in the file, unacknowledged, folded twice into a rectangle the exact size of the cards the list operator seemed to prefer. They built a listening room with outdoors and told people it was a library. The catalog was a metal cabinet with drawers numbered like teeth. Inside lay cards stamped with 3 colors of ink: black for confirmed, red for contested, gray for socially harmful rumors. In the ledger of 1966, the librarian, her badge said archive technician, though everyone called her Auntie, described the cards as if they were seeds. Each carries a weather, she wrote in pencil, where the supervisor would not look. Some sprout in a week, some rot, some bloom out of turn. She began clipping obituaries from the factory wall and matching them to the cards, most aligned by week, some by hour. When she wrote to a cousin in Oriol about card 3087 that matched a porter, crushed by a crate marked glass, the letter came back unopened with a blue hand that said, undeliverable. 2 days later, a man with a case asked whether she had a habit of writing to strangers. She replied that cousins were not strangers. He asked to see the catalog. She said libraries were for reading, not borrowing. That evening she found the lock picked and 1 drawer missing, the gray one. The station's internal memos took on the tone of applied theology. We must interrupt the association between broadcast and event, the director wrote in a paper titled Negation by Flood. They tried saturating the band with music, workers' choirs, and the brassy march that could drown a city square. The voice slid between stanzas like a needle through a hem. They tried noise generators, soft and coarse, and the voice grew louder, as if pleased at the attention. They tried silence, shutting the field for 2 weeks under the pretext of transformer service. The voice came on kitchen radios anyway, from sockets not plugged into anything, from galvanized buckets, from the grammar school loudspeaker that had been broken since the May parade. A teacher wrote up an incident. Children held their breath at the 3 knocks and did not exhale until the surname ended. I did not tell them to do this. I do not know who taught them. The pediatrician circulated a memo about oxygen deprivation. The party secretary posted it with a thumbtack that left a bruise in the cork like a fly pressed under glass. The aquarium acquired a twin known as the Icebox, a basement room lined with foil and lacquered paper where tapes arriving from Sverdlovsk were to be played for frequency analysis. An engineer named Petukov, who wore 3 belts of braided wire around his ankle because he trusted metal more than luck, logged a phenomenon he called backwash. After a playback, the building's plumbing sang with a high resonant tone for minutes, and the thermometer on the wall lost 2 degrees without a draft. The cold, he wrote, is not in the room, it is in the numbers. His supervisor marked the sentence with a question mark and a neat cross, which in their shop meant either good, pursue, or you will need a witness when they ask you why you wrote this. Petukov was later reassigned to a pumping station at Karachay and returned a year after without toenails on either foot. He walked as if measuring an invisible slope. There is a box in the file labeled Testimonies, Unsorted, that smells of cheap cigarettes and chalk. A tram driver swears he heard his own first name not from the radio, but from the trolley pole as it slid along the catenary at a junction with no power. A watchman says the dogs at the edge of the station began sleeping with their paws over their ears. When he tried the same, he found his own palms slick with a sap that tasted metallic and sweet. A girl from Class 8B says the voice once mispronounced a consonant and corrected itself. For that she was punished for mockery and made to clean the gym's windows. A woman from accounts insists she received a phone call in which the caller named her husband, the date, and the word water. Her husband drowned 2 days later in a creek shallow enough to cross in boots. The KGB major wrote in the margin, possible law of large numbers, sample bias, urban legend. Then lower, nevertheless, Map Creek. A denial campaign followed, elegant like a net. The factory newsletter ran a column on electrosuggestion, disclaiming any predictive power and blaming nerves. A traveling lecturer from Moscow gave a talk at the Palace of Culture on propaganda technique. If something appears in 3 uncoordinated places, you will call it true. Make one of those places your own. He showed posters of smiling children with radios, then a cartoon wolf with a tuning fork. After the lecture, he drank with the director of the radio club, whose hands shook. He asked him, cheerful in defeat, "When the wolf's fork strikes the air, do you see it?" The director said later he wished the wolf had been real. At least then the children would have a story with teeth. Across 1969, the file grows teeth of its own, photographs of tree bark peeled and hammered flat to sheets, each labeled with a date and pinned with dressmaker's pins above a line that reads, "Local EM response, audible." The sheets are scored with regular ridges like records. When played with a wooden needle attached to a stethoscope, the ridges murmur. The lab assistant who did this wrote in green ink, "Sounds like a fence in winter," where someone walking in felt boots across thin crust. Her name appears in a personnel memo 3 months later with a disposition. Relocated to Far East Coastal Lab, Marine Bioacoustics. The memo postscripts, "Issue galoshes." Someone in the station's orbit formalized the folklore. A booklet with a soft cover and no imprint circulated among security men and mechanics. It covered practicalities, as if teaching someone to survive on a ship. Do not sit facing the wire when the wind comes in from the slag heap. Wrap spoons in cloth. Keep a bucket of water by the door to drown the kitchen radio if it begins to speak. A chapter addressed those who heard their own names. Do not attempt to trade, it warned. Do not say no. Do not stay in the room alone for 3 days. Spend time in crowds, queues, baths, football. The margin shows a thumbprint in oil, and beneath it, a pencil correction. Leave bread for the forest. It remembers kindness. At least twice the station tried to invert the broadcast. They assembled names of those who had already died, old soldiers, women with scripts of illness already written into their bodies, and played them from the aquarium on a loop, hoping to satisfy the register. For a week, the nightly list quieted. Births went smoother, and the clinic midwife used less gauze. Then the ledger returned with young names in 3s, as if making up time. Do not feed it, someone wrote on a slip pasted to the aquarium door. The slip is dated and countersigned like a proper order, then underlined 3 times as if the underline itself were a ritual. One of the signatures belongs to the janitor who mopped Mint and Lightning. No file announces this plainly, but a change sets in as the 1970s approach. The voice acquires a delay between surname and date, a pause like someone realizing they have been overheard. The broadcast begins to arc beyond the settlement's circle. A lumber camp near Evedell reports hearing it on a baby monitor. A captain on a drainage barge in the Ob estuary logs a ladder of knocks at dusk. A geologist in Yakutia writes that he caught a parallel transmission out of a copper mine's winch room. He put his ear to the drum and heard numbers vibrate the cable. A bored meteorology technician on Wrangel Island tapes a snowfall and swears there are digits in the hiss. He is laughed at until the thaw. In the archive, a blue pencil adds 2 words to the map stencil: regional coupling. That winter, the station received a crate of equipment from a cooperating institution in Ukraine, a rack that smelled of sea wind and coal smoke, stamped with a logo in the outline of a fan. The rack was a receiver array for a different project entirely, a woodpecker that would later peck its way into every kitchen from Helsinki to Tehran. The covering note from Kiev said, "In case of interference, take this as an apology." The director wrote back, polite and fatigued, "Our interference is not yours. If we peck, it is with a beak made of names." The reply was blank, but for a coffee ring that could be the circumference of a watch. When the first operator disappeared, no one said the word. Her logbook ends with a tidy line. Signal at 4627 kHz, anomalously strong for 2140. Knock sequence curtailed at 2. Recommend check of span insulators, compartment 9. The next page is blank. A week later, the librarian Auntie folded her hands on the desk and refused to open the gray drawer because, she said, a person is a drawer until someone reads them. 2 months later, Krylov the forester's name resurfaced. Not in the forest, but typed on a requisition for cotton-wrapped wire, signed by a man who did not know him. When copies of copies are made, faces go white, lines blur, and people become the thickness of paper. Later, we find a photograph of a wedding in Lesogorsk where someone has pasted the groom's face over another man's with paste too glossy for the matte paper. Under certain light, you can see a profile beneath the smile, someone not invited, someone who stepped aside because the list preferred to walk through him. The margin of the photograph is notched 3 times, as if a thumbnail has tested the edge to see whether it will bleed. The winter they tried to switch it off remains the best documented failure. January 1973, temperatures settled at -30 and stayed. The Party Bureau approved a cold maintenance pause at the station, transformers bled down, feeder lines grounded with braided strap, aquariums and icebox left dark, a seal over the librarian's cabinet. The notice on the factory board used language red as a clenched fist. No unauthorized listening, no gatherings at dusk, no transmission folklore. At 21 on a Thursday, the substation's voltage trace flattened into a calm line like a sleeping heart. At 21:03, the list operator spoke. The voice came not from radios, those were unplugged, wrapped in towels, but from spaces that were not supposed to carry sound, a gap around a window frame, the seam of a cast-iron stove, the glaze of a kitchen tile trembling as if a fingernail had been drawn across it. Witness statements gathered by the militia are oddly poetic. The air turned to a comb. The steam over the pot counted time. The doorframe knocked because it remembered being a tree. 3 knocks, 4 digits, surname, Saturday. The engineers pretended physics could be sped up by walking faster. They ran with clipboards through frost that squeaked like powdered glass and found in their panic the comfort of measurement. Spectrum shots, ground loops checked, earthing pits opened with steaming spades. Nothing showed except a thin rime on the copper straps like breath. Petukov returned briefly from Karachay with his slow gait and socks thick as mitts, proposed a human ground, and for a night volunteers stood hand to hand along the inner fence, palms prickling, teeth tasting of pennies, until someone vomited bile into the snow and the line broke. The ledger recorded a partial. The voice mispronounced a consonant and did not correct itself. 2 names were skipped. The knocks arrived 2, then 1, as if the metronome stuttered. The next morning, the factory siren called a shift no one could keep upright for, and the clinic registered a run of fainting spells with pupils wide as spillways. The report to Sverdlovsk called it panic amplification in conditions of reduced amenities. The KGB major appended a study with a bureaucrat's smile. Subjects in closed settlements demonstrate heightened suggestibility in low light, high cold, and Thursdays. He recommended more cinema, brighter bulbs, a brass band on payday. He did not recommend shutting the station again. In private, he wrote to a colonel that the voice is less a signal than a mode of weather, and weather, in his training, demanded shelter, not argument. He proposed a parallel operation to dilute coincidence, a rotating list of decoy names broadcast from the aquarium at random intervals to flatten narrative expectation. The aquarium operators read names of saints and party functionaries mixed with footballers and chemical compounds. For a week, funerals slowed. On the 8th day, a bus slid at the tram junction, where the road always iced yellow before anywhere else. The casualties matched 2 of the decoys exactly. The major burned the paper strip on which the shift had been logged and wrote in the margin, "Counter-broadcasts are not prophylaxis. They are prayer." The forest altered its grammar under the strain. Snow around the span pylons grew a crust that broke not with a crack, but with a chime. Jays learned routes that skirted invisible corridors, and foxes trotted single file along the feeder trench as if using it like a compass laid in the earth. The forester who replaced Krylov submitted a map where track lines had been drawn, erased, drawn again, the erasures shining under graphite like wet ice. In his notes, he used a new word, avoidance, as if the trees themselves had opinions. He logged a phenomenon he could not file. On nights after the list ran long, sap bled through bark seams and set hard in beads that caught moonlight like solder. People made their own science of denial. Housewives lined windows with cardboard covered in the lead foil once used for X-ray cassettes. The foil made the rooms dim and gave tea a taste like the inside of a battery. The midwife who counted tremors in newborn eyelids learned to schedule deliveries for Mondays when she could. The chief scolded her for calendar superstition, then signed off on every Monday she asked. In the tram depot, a fitter wore his miner's helmet all day because it keeps the name from hearing me think. At the bathhouse, old men talked about the prison in the north where you could make a radio from bed springs and a razor blade. A younger mechanic said he would rather sleep in the snow than hear the voice through the wall. The janitor's mop water in the aquarium smelled of ozone even when the room stood unused. He poured it out into the alley and found an ice oval there, the size of a coffin lid that took weeks longer to thaw than anywhere else. Official denunciations became ceremony. A regional TV crew filmed a segment, women laughing with radios in clean kitchens, children in white shirts tuning to choral music, an engineer explaining capacitance with a grin that showed the strain of memorized lines. The crew asked to shoot the forest. The director offered them compartment 17, which had the good trees, the straight ones. The cameraman, a man from Tyumen with a child's alarm clock in his coat to keep time in snow, said his Nagra recorder had picked up a tap in takes where no one spoke. Back in the city, the station broadcast the piece with the audio replaced. The engineer's voice had been dubbed by someone with a smoother vowel. The cameraman wrote to a friend that he kept hearing 3 gentle sounds when he wound his alarm at night. He drowned the clock in a glass. It kept time under water for days. The disappearances accelerated in forms that legalized forgetting. Transfers to cooperating facilities, reassignments to northern lumber combines, a widow's notification that her husband had been sent to a health sanatorium near Novokuznetsk for rest, with an impossible departure date already passed. The librarian auntie managed to retire, a miracle no one remarked on aloud. She left her keys under a blotter and a note, "Books remember readers." When they broke open the gray drawer years later, they found blank cards that smelled faintly of iodine and machine oil, and underneath them, a single index card with a child's handwriting copied in ink. "Do not answer when they call you by name." The signature line was empty, a white space where a person should have been. The station's ledger of right name, wrong body entries acquired a sister. Wrong name, right hour. Accidents that fit the hour down to the minute, but attached to nobody on the list. The director wrote this up as a phase slip. His deputy, less cautious, wrote "Mercy" in the margin and was reassigned to a cement plant in Bashkiria. A rumor grew that death could be negotiated. Not a bargain exactly, but a displacement, the way water finds a new channel around a beaver's dam. Men slept on friends' floors on Thursdays. Women visited crowded laundries. The football pitch was a place of superstitious safety. When the militia broke up such gatherings, the ledger ticked up by the same count on another street. The KGB major did not know whether to disband crowds or encourage them. On his last report before transfer, he wrote, "The Voice recruits its own statistics. We maintain the appearance of choice." In 1979, a doctor from Tomsk arrived with a research permit and a stethoscope he wore like a talisman. He recorded hearts that stuttered in 3-beat motifs on Thursdays, and lungs that held air a second too long, as if listening. His paper, stamped for internal use, proposed an arrhythmia endemic to settlements with high-tension infrastructure. He measured the fields in factories, by the tram depot, under the antenna field fence. The only consistent anomaly lay in kitchens at dusk, an increase in voltage so slight it fit under the noise floor of any instrument they owned, and yet strong enough to trip a relay in an old radio chassis if it happened to be left warm. He ended his paper with a sentence that may have been a joke. "Perhaps domestic air responds to names." The editor returned it with a red question mark and a clipping about ionization from a Moscow journal. The doctor went home to Tomsk and died 2 winters later. "Quick," his widow said, while winding a clock. Sometime in the early 1980s, maps began to unlearn Lesogorsk. The city's code in the post office ledger no longer corresponded to any delivery route. The bus stop on the regional plan blinked out like a bulb that had flickered too long. The party committee moved its meetings to a room with no windows and left the chairs unnumbered. A notice ran in a central paper about rationalization of forestry assets, a phrase that can mean harvests or closures or the permission to erase. On a bulletin board, an unsigned clipping appeared about a radar array far to the southwest that ate shortwave like a woodpecker devouring bark. Beneath it, someone had penciled, not large, not bold, but with a hand that did not waver, "What if ours learned from theirs?" The pencil dug 3 dots after the sentence, then stopped, as if the hand had remembered a rule the rest of us are still trying to write down. They called it a coincidence when another red forest took a name already in circulation. April 1986 snapped like a cable. The memos do not say explosion, they say excursion, a word that would be beautiful if it did not mean a core walking through steel. In the weeks before, the station's ledger shows a fever of annotations, crossed out dates, doubled checks, a new column marked origin, like a shipping manifest. The list operator ran long on the Thursday before the 26th, voice oddly breathy as if read in a stairwell. A ham in Gomel caught 37 seconds of it and wrote "Reverb" in the margin of his log. He was visited by men who took his tapes and left him a receipt for household rubber footwear, line item 1 pair. In our archive, taped to an onion skin inventory, someone has placed a dead birch leaf that has leached its color into the paper like tea. The timing is impossible enough to be true. The key of telegrams that month stack like chimney bricks. One is misaddressed, meant for a ministry but delivered to a forestry office by a clerk with a fever. Unscheduled grid activity observed in northern sectors. Coordinating with radar units to minimize nuisance. meaning the woodpecker's tick eating the band as civil defense tried to speak without being heard. Another telegram later demands that all recordings of unofficial transmissions be surrendered as potential panic accelerants. Our station complied with performance, sealed boxes, wax like old teeth, an officer's signature that is not on any other document. The icebox log for the 27th reads, "No playback, excess noise, water in the film." The janitor says he mopped the aquarium twice that day and that the drain sang like a bottle. He says the water left a rust ring that never took scrubbing. The red forest in the zone turned the color of brick. You know that part of the story. But listen to a smaller field 400 kilometers away, where needles had reddened long before and now refused to change at all, as if insulted to be likened. A truck convoy passed our feeder road the week after, canvas tight on frames like bandages. Men in masks stepped out to check a map that had no Lesogorsk and asked a shepherd where the nearest nameplace was. The shepherd pointed to the sky. "Up," he said, and the men wrote down a kilometer post instead. In the settlement, a midwife who had learned to schedule Mondays sat in her kitchen and unfolded a pamphlet on iodine that had been photocopied until the letters looked like frost. She wrote on the back, in her neat hands, "Thursday list silent, Friday list doubled, infants sleep as if underwater." She died in 1990. Her daughter found the note in a book of recipes under a clipping that promised a pipeline of heat from a future that never arrived. Witnesses multiply and vanish in the same paragraph. A linesman sees a glow at the span insulators on a dry night and stares until his eyelids burn. He tells the militia and is given eye drops and told to sleep. A zoologist from Minsk brings a dosimeter to test woodpecker nests near the station boundary and leaves with a face the color of tallow. He writes in his field book, "Counts lowered, list louder." He draws a woodpecker's beak next to the words and crosses it out, as if fearful of metonymy. A nurse from Ivankiv, relocated here for rest, hears the voice while in line for bread and begins to cry soundlessly. She writes the digits on the inside of her wrist, and when she washes, they do not come off. She later says the ink had no smell. Her husband finds her handwriting gradually becoming like the ledger's hand, rounded, decisive, inhumanly even. Official language curdled into euphemism. A party circular assured the district that our forest is unconnected to inappropriate toponyms elsewhere, and that local nomenclature retains its historical primacy. The director of the station was instructed to attend a seminar on radar hygiene. He returned with a paper cup smelling of coal smoke and a rule of thumb he'd learned from a Kiev engineer. If you hear the pecker, there is nothing you can do. If you don't hear it, there is even less. He pinned the rule on the aquarium wall and signed it with a smiley face made of commas. The janitor took it down because it made the room look unserious. He folded it into quarters and tucked it where he kept his ration coupons. Years later, when the coupons had become souvenirs of hunger, he used the paper to start a stove. It burned with a sting that made his eyes water. Folklore went feral. Children played a new game where one stood in a doorway and read from a dictionary while others knocked on the floor in threes behind them. If the reader stumbled, everyone yelled, "Thursday," and the game ended without winners. Old men swore the list could be bribed with copper. Leave a coil on a stump and get a quiet week. Someone left a coil wrapped in newspaper. In the morning, fox prints circled it in a perfect ring, as if an animal with a compass in its skull had paced out a boundary. Women boiled pine needles and put the vapors into their clothes. A hairdresser said it made perms hold better on windy days. In the bathhouse, a woman who had worked near the Duga array spat and said, "Our woodpecker counted planes. Yours counts heads." She would not take off her watch even in the steam. The strap had rotted the skin under it into a bright band. A gray envelope marked "Compliance" arrived from Moscow and asked our station to correlate broadcast anomalies with registry data from the zone. The director wrote in reply, in a compact, courteous hand, that he did not undertake work with that archive because our mortality is homegrown. He attached a graph with two lines that rose together and then parted like tracks at a switch. A colonel visited to ask why the graph looked like betrayal. The director showed him sap beads on a shelf of bark samples that had arranged themselves into a triangle. The colonel asked if he was a mystic. The director said he was a statistician. The colonel said the difference was often budget. He left with a jar of resin and a promise to send a man with a better graph. We never met that man. Disappeared items gathered around the station like a weather front of loss. Tape spools labeled in green pencil returned brown and blank. A crate of rolled maps arrived damp, the water line like a horizon. When they dried, Lesogorsk's roads had bled into the paper and could not be traced without tearing it. The librarian auntie's gray drawer cards, rumored to invite misfortune, were reissued in a new color, hospital blue. Each blue card carried a faint watermark of 3 dots arranged like Orion's belt. A clerk who licked the back of one to stick it to a memo said her tongue went numb for an hour. She kept the numbness to herself because it made tea taste like memory. There are 2 letters from that year that no one should read and that everyone will. The first is from a young radiochemist at a plant upriver who writes to a friend in Leningrad. We are told to filter the river for iodine and cesium. We have only gauze. The gauze turns to jelly. At home, the radio speaks once a week in a voice I think I know from a train platform. If it says my mother's maiden name again, I will take a train anywhere. The friend never wrote back. The stamp was canceled with a wavy line that looks like winter breath. The second letter is from a man in the militia to his wife. Do not write names on calendars anymore. We will forget days and we will live. He died of a burst vessel while lifting a sack of flour at the station. His calendar was blank through December. The wall was clean except for 3 dents where a nail had been tested and pulled. The station attempted a last translation before the country began taking itself apart. They built a small room inside the aquarium, a box within a box, and seeded it with silence. No instruments, only a chair and a microphone disconnected from anything, like a prop in a play about responsibility. Volunteers sat and spoke into nothing, reading names of rivers, coffee brands, words that refused to attach to living people. Some felt better afterward, some felt worse. One man left crying because he had said his father's name out loud for the first time since the camp, and nothing had happened, which was its own kind of shiver. The janitor called the innermost room the wardrobe. The director objected. The word suggested fables and coats, and wrote vestibule on a card. The card fell off the door within an hour, and no one put it back. The last tape from before the flags changed has a fault that makes it feel candid. You hear the aquarium lamp buzz, the list operator's paper shift, someone in the corridor cough, the 3 soft knocks that could be wood, could be metal, could be a finger on a table. Then the voice reads 4 digits and a surname no one on the roster recognized. The date is Sunday. The station had learned to treat Sundays as a reprieve. That Sunday the tram derailed at the curve by the canteen, where the road always iced before anywhere else. The driver's name matched the tape within a consonant. The newspaper corrected it Monday with a small note. Typographical error. The correction sits in our file like a baked-in flaw in glass. You must squint to see it, and once you do, you cannot look away from the hairline crack. By the late 1980s, the lists thinned, or our talent for listening did. The radio club's last president locked the door and posted a sign, closed until warmer times. The sign stayed through 3 seasons because winters blur when wages are late, and the pantry shelves smell of glue. The station's accounts shifted to a new ministry with a new stamp anyone could forge with a potato and a rubber eraser. The janitor carried the mop bucket down the hall one morning and found the aquarium window open for the first time in a decade. Snow had drifted onto the microphone and left a sugar crust on the metal. He closed the window and ran the mop along the sill. It left a clean stripe that smelled like mint and lightning. He did not tell anyone. He had learned the economy of what to keep. Outside, the forest stood, wrong-colored but still itself, thorns and rust and bird bones. Somewhere between the wires a carrier held. Somewhere, the habit of calling names looked for a new way to be necessary. They called the decade a transition, as if you could cross it on a footbridge without getting wet. The station's letterhead changed 3 times in a year. Ministry of Communications to a joint stock something with a postal box that accepted cash and envelopes, then a forestry enterprise with a logo of a tree drawn by someone who had never seen one. Guards sold their sheepskin coats at the market when diesel went from rationed to rumor. The aquarium light failed, and no requisition replaced it. Someone brought a desk lamp from home with a cracked bakelite shade the color of nicotine. The janitor kept sweeping because floors make a kind of promise. In the ledger, the list operator appears as irregular, attenuated, then as a habit you can forget until it chooses not to forget you. The radiogram hum now lived in gaps, between weather and news, between the samovar's sigh and the kettle's click. People heard enough to keep a drawer of foil handy, and not enough to explain to a landlord from Tyumen why Thursday still had a shape. Privatization made everything official and nothing accountable. A man with a new tie and an old scar bought the feeder trench for scrap and sold the copper to an intermediary who sold it to a foundry that sold it to a cable plant that sold it back to the same trench, thinner. A company registered in Cyprus leased the forest to Playground LLC, which installed a red sign promising a ropes course that never appeared. A surveyor painted the span pylons with numbers in reflective paint. At night, the digits floated like buoys above the scrub, and drivers learned to count them under their breath without knowing why it steadied them. A regional deputy toured the site with a television crew and called it an eco-industrial heritage park, then asked off-camera whether it was safe to stand under the wires. The cameraman, older now, said, "No more or less than yesterday." His new recorder clicked twice by itself. Witnesses acquired the muscles of telling. A retired bookkeeper brought a teapot to meetings of a history club and poured stories like black tea, unstrained. The librarian auntie, she said, took her keys home. At night she turned them in her hand, and they were warm. A former Komsomol organizer carried a notebook with a laminated photo of himself speaking into a megaphone at a May parade. On the back, he had pasted a list of surnames torn from a payroll register and underlined the ones he could not account for with a red pencil that had teeth marks. A radio amateur, now a taxi dispatcher, brought an old vacuum tube as a charm and set it on the table like a relic. "When it glows without current," he said, "you leave the room." Someone laughed. No one argued. In the back, a woman who had been a nurse in the zone for 4 months scribbled in blue ink on a napkin, and then in her palm because the napkin tore, and later held out her hand like a map with rivers blurred by sweat. New folklore cross-pollinated with old. From St. Petersburg came a rumor of a bear that ran towards sirens. From Kolyma, a postcard with a drawing of a tower that looked like an ice-locked metronome. A trucker swore the voice had migrated to highway call boxes. He pulled over at kilometer 197 and heard 3 knocks through a handset that had been dead since the finance ministry closed. "It said a surname I only use at the passport office," he told the policeman who stopped to check his load. The policeman wrote him a fine for stopping on the shoulder and avoided the call box with the care of a man who has decided that he does not hear things while in uniform. In a hostel, a man with prison tattoos showed a scar that circled his wrist like a bangle and said it came from cupping his hand over a radio speaker that warmed without a plug. "It leaves a mark if you try to hold it back," he said. He wanted money. He got tea. Documents democratized themselves, photocopies of photocopies. Watermarks dissolved to ghosts. A packet labeled Explanations for Audit contained salary lists. A hand-drawn plan of vestibule with measurements in pencil and a coffee ring overlapping the drain, and a memo from the director that read like a letter to someone he could not name. "Your absence is not proof. We will inventory it anyway." The packet included an order to cut the lines flush to the soil and pour tar over the ends. The order was signed by a man who had been dead for 2 years. The new director stamped it "complied" and wrote "symbolic" in parentheses. The tar stayed sticky through first frost. In 1993, a pirate radio calling itself Myar Red went on the air from what the newspapers called the Taiga, and locals called the back of the sawmill. It broadcast songs about cities that didn't exist and interviews with men whose voices were too calm. At midnight on Thursdays, it left a minute of blank, and then a woman read numbers and surnames that sounded like parodies until a fisherman from the reservoir failed to come home, and no one could bear to make the joke again. The militia visited the supposed address of Myar Red and found a trailer with a staple gun on the table and a calendar turned to March forever. "The transmitter is a van," a boy said, smart beyond his years and shivering in a t-shirt. "It goes where it is needed." An officer cuffed him for impertinence and then uncuffed him because his hands felt cold through the boy's skin. Environmental effects refused to assemble into a science and refused to disperse into nonsense. Patches of moss under the wires stayed wet in heat. A digital watch gained 3 seconds on Thursdays. A willow grew leaves that looked lacquered in frost in July. In a veterinary clinic, a dog collapsed whenever the kettle boiled, as if the steam itself triggered a switch. The vet removed the kettle from the waiting room and told owners to be patient and not to whistle. On a hill outside the settlement, someone arranged 3 coils of found copper into a triangle and left a bottle of vodka in the center with a note, "Thank you for last week." The bottle was gone in the morning. A ring of dead grass remained. A schoolboy painted 3 dots in the corner of every page of his homework. When his mother asked why, he said, "To teach the paper to wait." Official denials pivoted to culture. A glossy magazine ran a spread on Soviet Weird, listing the Red Forest among amusements, giant rings of concrete, abandoned mosaics, art made of switches. The station did not merit a photograph. An artist posed among birches with a theremin and called the resulting album Weather Reports. A critic praised the hauntology of late socialism. In our file, someone pasted the clipping and wrote with a blunt pencil, "They are making a museum of our climate." A later hand added, "Museums are where you keep things you cannot bury." A deputy minister toured and smiled for cameras. When a journalist asked her about the lists, she said, "There were many lists in those years," and moved on to the ribbon cutting. The ribbon was red. Everything was. 3 survivors became necessary to the story, as if narrative demanded a tripod. The first was the janitor, who finally retired with a watch that refused to tick on Thursdays. He kept the mop, as men keep rifles after parades, and leaned it against a wardrobe that had become an altar for ordinary tools. Screwdriver, wire cutters, a roll of gauze. He said the aquarium window sometimes opened by itself on clear nights, and that closing it felt like turning down a bed in an empty house. The second was the linesman's daughter, who had moved to a city with an airport and came back every August with a child who pressed 3 fingers against the kitchen tile as if it had a pulse. She collected resin beads and kept them in a jar labeled sugar. When asked, she said, "It fools no one. Names prefer their own shapes." The third was the librarian auntie, skin thin as paper and eyes that made you think of carbon copies. She kept a card in her pocket, blue, blank, soft at the edges from being worried by a thumb. "Every time someone says the settlement is a myth," she said, "this card warms. Nothing warms without current." A file fragment from 1995 records a meeting no one admits to having chaired. The agenda: disposition of archival materials, coordination with interior troops regarding trespass, investigation into reports of mobile broadcast units. The minutes are sparse. Someone proposes burying a shipping container with the aquarium tapes. Someone else says no ground in this forest keeps its promises. A man from a petroleum firm offers sponsorship for a light art installation using the old pylons. A woman asks whether their children can be taught to ignore the 3 knocks with a song. No motions carry. The last line reads, "We will not meet again unless summoned." The word summoned sits on the page like a slip. You can pretend it says invited. You can, if you like, pretend many things. As the decade slid, the list took on a character of aftermath. More first names, fewer surnames, dates without years, as if the archive itself had grown tired of precise filing. The radio amateur turned dispatcher said sometimes he heard a knock in the space between digits of a phone number. People learned to let a ring go 6 beats before answering. The deputy with the eco-park scheme lost an election, and later a son. He stopped talking about heritage and started asking the janitor for any tape that had his boy's voice on it, even a cough in a corridor. The janitor said there were no tapes, and it was true by then. Sound became a rumor again. The settlement aged. The map continued to misremember. A sign on the highway pointed to villages that had changed their names 3 times. A vandal added a new board in red paint. Red Forest, left. The arrow pointed into scrub, then into thought, then into the habit of listening that people once had before language rearranged their nerves. Somewhere, something counted with care. Somewhere else, someone found that they had begun to count with it. They decided the forest would become content. A cable channel from Moscow arrived in 1998 with a presenter in a leather coat and a cameraman who had once filmed floods. They brought bottled water and a generator and a plan titled Red Forest, Ghosts of Industry. The presenter rehearsed lines about forgotten utopias and the poetry of rust. The janitor unlocked the aquarium with a ring of keys that had lost their teeth. The door stuck, then gave with a sigh like a bed someone had left in a hurry. The desk lamp's bakelite shade had cracked further, a brown leaf. The microphone looked like a relic salvaged from a ship. "We shoot B-roll," the cameraman said, tapping the mic. It did not move. The presenter asked the janitor whether there were any papers left. The janitor said there were always papers. He did not take them to the librarian's cabinet. He took them to the wardrobe, vestibule to those who distrusted metaphor, now a box lined with insulation torn from old refrigerator doors. The presenter peered in and said the smell reminded him of winter train stations. He did not say which city. They recorded for 3 days. On the second night, the presenter practiced a stand-up in the feeder road, snow squeaking under his boots. This is a place where silence has a frequency. And on the third day, the cameraman began to keep count of mistakes where he had always trusted his hands. He heard 3 knocks when he lifted the viewfinder. He heard 3 knocks when he unscrewed a filter. He heard 3 knocks when he wrapped tape around a cable that had begun to fray into copper hairs. Coincidence, he told the sound man, who said he had lost the left channel somewhere between the canteen and the tram stop and that the meter flickered when there was no signal at all. The presenter tried to say coincidence with a smile, then practiced it without. He asked for a different word. They left with 6 cassettes, a jar of resin for atmosphere, and a paper the janitor had slipped between their release forms, a copy of a 1971 memo stamped Operative Technical Group with the line, "If interruption is not possible, overlay with the acceptable." They aired a version of their program with a flatted soundtrack of harmonium and wind. A week before broadcast, the presenter's mother received a call with 3 soft sounds and a woman reading a name that had been hers when she was 19 and married to a man who went away. The date was 2 days later. She slipped on ice, bringing in wood. The station issued condolences. The presenter took his leather coat off on air for a charity drive and did not put it back on that winter. The cameraman sent the janitor a postcard of a lighthouse where he had gone on assignment. On the back he wrote, "I hear it in the buoy bell." The card never reached Lesogorsk. The post office clerk slotted it into a box marked addressee unfound and later took it home because the stamp was pretty. The turning came like ice you do not see until the whole river shifts. A cell tower sprouted near the feeder road in 2001, a white tube with a panel crown and a fence that looked like an apology. Teenagers stood under it to get signal and traded ringtones in the cold. The three knocks entered the city as an option called Default 3. A girl named Anya saved it and set it for unknown callers. One Thursday it rang without a number. She answered. The air turned to felt. Something in the handset's tiny speaker breathed like a distant train. She heard 4 digits and the name she had signed onto a marriage certificate and then scratched off with a coin when it was over. The date was Saturday. On Saturday, the turnstile at the market caught her coat and held on. She fell. The crowd moved. She stopped moving. A boy in a black beanie, who had never learned what a factory siren meant, put his fingers to her neck like movies had taught him and whispered, "We need a better sound." The tower did not care. It hummed like wet wire. Someone in the district administration called what happened next Operation Sanitization. The minutes survive in the folder with others that were never meant to be bound. Remove road signage. Close cadastral entries. Transfer utility debt to regional index. Reassign postal code. Designate area as forest tract without services. Coordinate with tax office to forgive records as error. A map with gray blocks shows streets with names erased, like teeth knocked out of a smile. The deputy who once promised an eco-park signed the last line and wrote routine in the margin. His pen left a dot of ink over the I. The dot bled into the paper like a bruise. The militia, now with another name, newer uniforms that looked thin in wind, cleared squatters and curiosity seekers with a line of vans and borrowed riot shields. They posted notices that cited a forestry regulation about deadfall hazard and risk of technogenic contamination, words that looked important even when they had been scrubbed of meaning. The janitor handed over a key he had not used in years and refused to surrender the mop. The linesman's daughter wrapped the jar labeled sugar in newspaper and took it to her car. The librarian auntie, smaller now, folded her blue card in half and put it in her pocket. When a young officer asked what she was hiding, she opened her hand. A place we have already left. He let her pass because he had a grandmother and because something about her eyes suggested that arguing would cost him a word he had not yet used. The station did not go quietly. Men in commuter jackets with metal tags around their necks unloaded a shipping container with a Faraday lining into the aquarium yard and called it a secure vault. They stacked tapes that were supposed to be blank inside and closed the door like closing a trunk with something heavy in it. At dusk, frost traced the container's seams in a pattern like handwriting. The vault's padlock sweated. The frost melted in 3 dots, a line. In the night, a guard saw his breath go still in front of his face for 3 seconds that he could not count. He opened the container in the morning and found a smell like mint and lightning that made his mouth water and then go dry. The tapes had printed through with a faint, even band of hiss, 4 digits barely there, a name he could not read even if he had wanted to. He locked the door again and signed the form where it said, safe. People made last visits the way you visit an apartment you know will be knocked through. A woman brought a thermos and 2 cups and sat on the feeder trench and poured tea for herself and for the space beside her where a sister used to sit. A man walked with a spool of wire on his wrist and unwound it along the ditch until it snagged on thorns. Then he tugged, and the spool came off with a sound like a slow yawn. The radio dispatcher unscrewed the last vacuum tube he owned and buried it under a rock where the tram shelter had been. He wrote a note and weighed it with the rock. Do not excavate. The note blew away. The rock stayed. The new telecommunications contractor sent out men to inventory meters. They photographed the dusty dials in houses slated for demolition. The photos, printed at a 1-hour shop in town, came back with faint overprints, 3 pale circles in the corners, a shadow of digits across the kitchen floor where sunlight slabbed in. The clerk at the shop said it was light leak. The contractor said it was legacy radiation. The lineman still on the payroll said it was habit. He told a young colleague to touch the meter glass and tell him whether he felt heat under it when the list ran. The young man said he felt the opposite. Good, the lineman said. That means it's still listening. A university team from Yekaterinburg arrived with graduate students and a grant to study post-industrial folklore. They collected jokes, there were few, songs, none anyone would sing on tape, and hexes, 3 varieties, each contradicting the others. They spent a night in the canteen and recorded the murmur of wind in ducks. When they slowed the tape in the lab, the spectrogram painted a comb of even teeth. The supervisor wrote a paper that flirted with heresy. Acoustic residua in abandoned infrastructures. She avoided words like prediction, fate, registry. In the conclusion, she suggested that what people called the list was a convergence of expectation and artifact. In a coffee line, a maintenance man who had helped her find plugs for old Soviet extension cords said, "Did you hear it, though?" She said she had heard many things. He said, "That is not an answer. Turning points are only visible from the hill you did not climb. For those who moved away, the list faded into a story about a place where Thursday felt like a bruise. For those who stayed close, on purpose or because a bus fare is a budget, Thursday kept a taste like coin. A shopkeeper in the nearest named town learned to switch off the radio at dusk and to count her till in threes, not because she feared the voice, but because the rhythm put numbers in order. A policeman who had ticketed a trucker at kilometer 197 began to answer his phone on the 7th ring. His wife complained he missed calls. He said he missed nothing important. The librarian auntie died as quietly as a page turned, at home, with the blue card folded into a tuck that kept it from opening when the dresser was moved. The undertaker wrote her surname on a tag and tied it with a bowline knot. The knot held the first time. That winter, 3 men in a van painted the color of sky, parked on a ridge, and pulled a collapsible mast to its full height. They wore vests that said Spectrum in English and Russian and sipped tea out of enamel mugs. At midnight they logged a knock they called electrical. At EOROS 05, another they called thermal. At EOROS 09, 3 soft impacts on their mast guy wire that could have been branch, bird, or a hand. The youngest leaned out and said into night air, "How do you want us to categorize you?" The senior said, "We don't talk to weather." They packed at dawn. On their way down the road, the van's radio, wired to nothing because they distrusted batteries in cold, ticked 3 times like someone thinking. They drove faster. The turning ended, not with a ceremony, but with a line in a database. Area code reclaimed. The map on a government site drew a green polygon that stopped shy of the feeder road and shaded the rest as forest with no attributes. The polygon had a notch in it the shape of a finger. The deputy who had once promised a ropes course lost his password and did not ask for a new one. A new deputy pinned up a poster about emergency preparedness and crossed out the word radio with a black marker because no one had one. In the old library, now a shop for nails and rope, the owner found a gray drawer without rails and used it to store screws. At the bottom lay a single card with 3 pale dots that had survived laundering. He put it in the till. The register jammed on Thursdays until he took it out and slid it under the doormat. Customers stepped on it without knowing. By spring, the pylons had been cut low and left like bones. The feeder trench filled with water that turned tea-colored and then clear. The cell tower blinked a red light the color of a warm coil. You could stand on the ridge and smell thaw, sap, soil, the breath of things taking their shape after cold. If you held your phone out and waited, you could see bars climb from 1 to 3 to 5, and then drop to none for the length of 3 heartbeats. People said a new network was coming. They said everything would be one signal soon, smooth as glass. They said the forest would become parkland and the station, a legend sold with magnets at a petrol kiosk. Somewhere under the moss, copper turned green. Somewhere, a list prepared to say a name with a vowel it had not practiced. Somewhere, the habit of not answering tightened like a knot. You can unknot only if you remember how it was tied. The withdrawal from the map did not end the habit of counting. After the vans departed and the padlocks shone new, someone still phoned the nearest town hall on Thursdays to report Environmental irregularity. The clerk, who had inherited a desk with drawers that rasped like sand, filled out a form titled Incident, Technogenic, Rumor, and filed it under T. By spring, he had a stack that leaned left. An audit team from the oblast arrived with clipboards and a camera that used cards, not tape. They wore reflective vests and spoke in words that summarized things into metrics: hazard, vector, exposure minutes. In the canteen, now a shell with flaking murals of wheat, they found a notice board with dates written in the librarian's hand up to 1991, and then a gap, and then a penciled 3 dots under the word April. The lead auditor took a photo. The card corrupted when he put it into his laptop. The file name that appeared in its place was a 4-digit block and a surname his grandfather had used before the passport reform in the 1970s. Scrap disappeared in a time lapse you could feel in your teeth. Men with cordless grinders cut the feeder pylons to shin height. Someone dug into the trench and found copper the color of olives, still clean at the core. The scrapyard weighed coils on a scale whose dial stuck for a second at 3 o'clock, then jumped. A buyer from Samara paid cash and told the yardman, friendly, "Copper is honest. Copper only tells you what you give it." The yardman said sometimes it hummed when it was cold. The buyer laughed. He held his hand over a bin and said, "Feel that? The field." The yardman felt nothing. The buyer drove away with a cargo that sang at the corners of his mirrors on the motorway. He turned up the radio. Between stations, a breath. A university lab in Yekaterinburg obtained permission to process legacy materials. The professor in charge wrote a grant in English because English had money and titled it Archive of Name-Environment Interactions. The phone rang while she typed and stopped after 3 beats. She let it go to voicemail and later found a file with no audio and a spectral spike at 4.627 kHz. Her students came back from fieldwork with interviews. An undertaker who wrapped tags around toes with a sailor's knot and said the freezer hummed like a transformer on Thursdays. A telecom technician who swore that on certain nights the cell tower's ground potential rose the thickness of a fingernail and every handset in a 500-meter radius registered a phantom wake at exactly 21:03. A cashier who had learned to close her till at 20:55 because the drawer refused to slide at 21 to 21:05 even when she kicked it. The professor warned them not to dramatize. They put a metronome in the vestibule and filmed it. For 3 minutes it ticked. Then, for 3 beats, it did not. A retiree from the district transport office brought a cardboard notebook tied with string. It was a dispatch ledger from 1972-1976, filled in with green ink, workmanlike. He wanted to be paid for it. The professor gave him tea and a small honorarium. The ledger showed routine truth: fuel shortages, drivers on sick leave, axles cracking in cold, and then a run of anomalies: convoy departures delayed by 17 and 19 minutes every Thursday in February 1973, a note to self: check with station before scheduling cement runs. The old man, embarrassed by his own usefulness, told a story and then apologized for it. He had once watched a tram driver tap his shift key 3 times before taking the handle, and when he asked why, the man had said, "So the day will pay attention." The old man laughed while he spoke. He did not laugh when he remembered that the driver died in a ditch with his hand still closed. The class fell quiet the way rooms do around a spilled glass. 2 journalists rediscovered the Red Forest as a genre, and the internet did what it does. It made the story larger and then thinner. A site with black backgrounds and white text ran a grainy clip of the aquarium, actually a thermal camera view of an unheated room in a different town, and a WAV file called Red Forest List, 1968. Wave, that was nothing but brown noise with 3 harder peaks. Comments multiplied. A woman from Perm wrote that her grandmother's surname had played out of the stove grate the day before she fell asleep forever in the armchair. A man from Kharkiv claimed he had decoded the digits into grid coordinates that pointed to a cemetery where stones leaned as if the frost had trained them to bow. A moderator pinned a post. Correlation causation. The thread scrolled past it like a convoy ignoring a detour sign. Official response adapted an old posture to a new uniform. A state agency issued an FAQ. The toponym Red Forest is widely used for areas with conifer die-off. Any broadcasts referred to are likely misidentified industrial signals or foreign shortwave. There is no evidence of predictive transmission. Individuals experiencing distress should contact local health services. A second document, unlinked but cached, said, maintain low profile, redirect inquiries to cultural heritage offices, avoid technical specifics, do not admit to possession of tapes. The professor filed a request under the new transparency law for materials relating to list-like transmissions, and received 3 envelope-thin replies with heavy stamps. Not located, funds restructured, privatized company records, not state property. She framed one and called it art. When the exhibition opened, the janitor came in a clean shirt and stood before the frame with his hands behind his back like a man at parade. He said to no one, "We paid for that stamp." The cemetery in the nearest named town started misremembering en masse. On 5 stones, the month had slipped by 1. A 6th had the correct date, but a wrong year that would have made the dead a child. Families blamed the mason, who blamed the registrar, who blamed a laptop that froze on Thursdays. The registrar brought the laptop to the shop, and the technician found nothing wrong, except that when he typed the surname Antipov, the cursor paused after the N long enough to make him feel watched. He rebooted. It did not happen again. He told no one because this was a town where you measure your words like flour in a bad year. Environmental science did its best to be a science. A biologist set cameras to catch foxes at the feeder trench. On Thursdays, the foxes conga-lined as usual, tails high, but the frames had a partial double exposure, and on 3 of them a bright dot hung in the upper left corner like a planet that the lens had decided to invent. A hydrologist logged pH drift in the ditch during snowmelt. It traced an oddly regular sawtooth that made her think of combs. She submitted to a journal. The reviewer asked whether she had controlled for cultural noise, by which he meant, did she believe? She wrote back that water did not believe and that the meter belonged to no one. The paper was rejected for tone. Then there were the disappearances that knew how to fill out forms. A postman moved to a coastal town crowded with cruise ships and thought of nothing but salt. He returned in a box after an accident in which 2 minutes had gone missing from a dash cam. The label on the box called him by a name he had never used in public. A school teacher resigned by text with a 3-word message, "I hear Thursdays," and stopped answering her phone. Her bicycle was found leaning against a pylon stump. The paint on the frame had bubbled in a pattern like fish scales you could read as code, if you were the sort to hieroglyph. A graduate student on the professor's team went to interview a former guard and returned with a tape of wind and a stare like someone who has learned a new alphabet by being made to stand in it. By 2007, a wildfire licked the cut stumps and revealed copper roots like veins. Firefighters in plastic helmets stomped through ground that jolted like a warning when their tools struck metal hidden under humus. A crew leader said he heard a tapping in the crackle and thought it was a beetle until it counted to 4 and stopped. He did not report it. He reported that the fire stopped at the feeder trench as if discouraged. A week later, mushrooms frilled the ash in a ring. A grandchild's hand found a marble that had spent 20 years in dirt and came up smooth as a yes. A prefecture-level man requested a briefing with maps. The new director, what do you call a director when the institution is a memory of paybooks? Met him in a borrowed office, unrolled a sheet whose corners curled from years, and said words like coherence and registry out of habit, because in his mouth they were less dangerous than fate and list. The prefecture man listened with one ear, wrote with a ballpoint that left a trench on the paper, and then asked for numbers. The director said the numbers were the point. The prefecture man said precisely, "What can I cut?" The director said, "The signage, the phones, the habit, The prefecture man said, "We do not legislate habits." On a Friday in autumn, the janitor died quietly, swept into his own corridor. The watch on his wrist ticked without pause. His daughter unfolded the notes from his pockets and found receipts, a key with no teeth, and a folded index card that had once been blue and was now the color of skin. A priest who had not heard confessions in years stood by the coffin and said only the names. He kept his sentences short because there had been a time, everyone remembered, when you did not dare speak at length in that voice. After the burial, someone knocked 3 times on the gate to straighten a wreath. Everyone heard it. No one turned around. At the end of that year, the professor published a book with a gray cover and a title that could be read as a joke or a sacrament. The Listening Field. She wrote of wires and mouths, of forests that learned grammar, of people who tried to cut stories the way you cut cable, and found that names are scaffold and weather both. She did not write about the tape they had found in a biscuit tin at a flea market, because it was a wedding tape, salt-wrinkled, and the 3 knocks interrupted the toasts in a way that made laughter sound like weeping. She kept it in a drawer that she opened on Thursdays, not to play it, only to weigh it in her hand. She said to her students, "You cannot prove a rumor, you can only survive it." They nodded and took notes, and did not write the sentence down because writing it would make it circular. They left the drawer alone. But the habit of the hand that wants to hold weight, and the drawer that warms when you think of it, that remained, like the whisper of a carrier line you swear you cannot hear until it stops, and the room grows immeasurably, disorientingly quiet. The last folder is not a folder, but a directory on a server that answers only on Thursdays. Its address passed mouth to mouth like a childhood dare, a string of digits with a slash and a word in English, listening. Students in a lab clicked at 21 and watched a progress bar creep like frost. Inside were scans of carbon copies, a tape image named Tape Gualo 4 Sun, a photo of a hand holding a blue card that had gone the color of skin. The server's clock ran 3 seconds fast. When the professor tried to mirror the contents to her drive, 3 files refused to move and blinked, then settled into names that were 4 digits and a surname, none of them hers, all of them familiar. In the morning, the directory said "Access Denied," and the administrator account vanished from the login screen. A graduate with a gift for networks shrugged and said, "Cosmetics," then added, "or etiquette." Developers came with clipboards and maps that were as confident as fresh asphalt. A data center needed cool ground and cheap power. The old substation was a geometry problem with a ready answer. The surveyors hammered stakes where the feeder trench had been and watched water tremble in the boreholes as if remembering a habit of passing signals. A manager in a windbreaker priced the pylons as scrap 3 times and wrote the sum with a neat hand. He underlined it twice as if to pin the number to the earth. In the bid documents, the place became Parcel 7, a neutral mouthful that made the tongue behave. The project summary said, "No cultural heritage." The deputy who once promised a ropes course signed a letter of non-objection and went home to a house where the clock had begun to pause on Thursdays, long enough for tea to cool. His wife stopped asking him what he did at work. He stopped answering questions in the voice that sounded like a receipt. They held a hearing for form. The audience was a mix. Men who remembered coil weights by feel. Women who remembered infant eyelids tremoring when the transformer breathed. Children who brought phones to film ruins that were already rubble. The project lead put up slides. Heat maps of productivity. Sketches of a low building with vents like gills. A fire technician recommended a ring main and an inert gas system. A woman with a jar labeled sugar asked whether the plans accounted for the habit of the air. The planner smiled professionally and said, "We have redundancy." The janitor's daughter ran a hand along the edge of her jar, then set it on the table. Resin beads slipped, then held. "So did we," she said. The chair noted the comment. The stenographer typed, "So do we." No one corrected the tense. At the edge of the site, a private museum opened in a prefabricated cube that smelled of gypsum and coffee. The sign over the door said, Red Forest Interpretive. Inside were vitrines with bakelite receivers posed like sculptures, a model of a pylon with LEDs, a playback of a tape that had been corrected until the noise sounded respectable. The guide spoke in a voice smooth for tourists. Experimental forestry, Cold War communications, local myths. She skipped the ledger with the right name, wrong body column, skipped the memorandum about overlay with the acceptable, skipped the wardrobe within a room people had called the vestibule when they were being disciplined, and the wardrobe when they were being honest. A boy in the back asked if the list had a theme song. The guide, trained for kindness, said, the theme was industry. The boy's mother looked at the jar and thought of sugar and lightning and did not speak. On a Thursday close to winter solstice, a live stream on a platform that refuses to die drew a small audience. Men in dark rooms, women in kitchens with tiled walls that still held heat, a trucker parked under a cell tower flashing its red eye. Title, Red Forest Transmission, Live. The camera stared at nothing with conviction. Comments scrolled like prayers and jokes and arithmetic. 3 knocks when? Wrote someone whose username was a 4-digit block. 3 knocks or we go outside, wrote another. At 21:03, the streamer's microphone popped with the mechanical innocence of a relay. The chat slowed, then accelerated as numbers appeared in text, first as taunts, then nervous repetitions, then a chorus that turned annotation into event. After 2 minutes, the stream died. The recorded file corrupted. The thumbnail showed frost on a metal surface with finger-width streaks, like lines made by a child taught to write before letters made sense. The data center broke ground the next spring. Machines rolled in, teeth low, mouths full of earth. The trench became an argument about drainage. On the first pour, a truck's drum stalled for 3 beats and then spun. The site manager wrote it in his pocket notebook with the same disgust he reserved for delays. He slept under a humming air conditioner in a rental where the kitchen tile felt faintly warm on Thursdays and dreamt of someone clearing their throat politely before saying a surname he had never used out loud. He stopped using the word likely. He started saying probably. Language adjusts its load the way a cable does. After so many years of denial, an official plaque was small and careful. It stood at the edge of a path in a park that was not quite a park, a sheet of anodized aluminum with a typeface that pretended neutrality. It said, "Here stood an installation of unknown purpose, mid-20th century. Local folklore associates this site with unusual broadcasts. Please respect the environment." Beneath it, 3 screws had been driven too deep and left proud, like nails someone intended to finish later. A hand, perhaps a child's, traced the heads with a fingertip until the skin reddened. In winter, frost took the plaque and returned it with a soft film like breathed glass. If you brought your ear close, you could hear your own blood. The professor retired and left her key to a colleague who liked to measure. She kept 1 drawer. Inside lay a wedding tape, salt puckered, and the blue card that was now the color of old paper. On Thursdays she did not play the tape. She did, however, take it out and feel its weight shift in her palm as if it contained a coil. She mailed a copy of her book to an address in Sverdlovsk Oblast that the registry no longer recognized. The package returned with a stamp in blue, undeliverable. She saved the envelope because the ink smelled faintly of winter and coal. On her last day, she wrote a line in her notebook. "We misdescribe the red forest when we say it spoke. It taught us to listen to our own denial. There are still men who swear they hear 3 soft sounds when they set a glass on a kitchen tile on a Thursday. There are women who hang spoons in cloth because of grandmothers, not because they believe. There is a boy who rides the bus past a blank field and counts pylons that are no longer there and gets the right number every time. There is a clerk who enters a name into a registry and watches the cursor pause and knows that machines inherit habits the way streets inherit footsteps. There is a deputy who stands in front of a camera and says, "There was no city here," and means, "Not now." The air between the fence posts that rusted away still carries a taste if you stand in it long enough, mint and lightning, like the breath of a word that has chosen not to finish itself. We can inventory the receipts and the resin, the jars labeled sugar that fool no one, the tapes that print through, and the cameras that corrupt. We can model soil conductivity and the memory of copper. We can stamp denied in blue and watch it flake into the drawer. We can build a data center whose fans sing a steady key over ground that once hummed on schedule. But after the tour, after the interpretive video, after the sponsor's wine in plastic cups, someone will still stand in a dark kitchen and find themselves listening for a relay that isn't there and a voice that never needed a radio. Was a city erased cleanly to tidy a ledger? Or did the ledger predate the city, and the city was scaffolding built to excuse a habit of weather that counts? The folders never say. The map says nothing at all. The forest, when the wind is wrong, sounds very slightly like a finger rapping politely on wood, and you will find your hand halfway to the drawer before you remember to stop.